Hello everyone, it's Shannon here. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we are going to create a Slimline card using the new Nesting Slim Layers dies, as well as the Mermaid Mail combo set. I'm also going to share with you how to stretch the new Under the Sea panel die and use it for Slimline cards as well. We're going to start by stamping our images. This is the Mermaid Mail combo set, comes with the stamp set and the matching dies in the back. I'm going to pull off several stamps from this set and I'm going to stamp them onto Bristol paper. We're going to do some low water watercoloring with Tombow dual brush pens, and Bristol paper has a nice smooth texture. It works really well for watercoloring with Tombow dual brush pens. And I am also going to stamp the images in VersaFine Onyx black ink, which is a waterproof ink. Now that my images are stamped, it's time to watercolor. I'm going to spray some water down onto my water media mat, and then I'm going to start with my marker direct to paper and just color in part of the tail. I'm going to then take a damp brush and kind of color over those areas with the ink to kind of stretch that ink out. I did also scribble a little of that ink down onto my water media mat, and I'll pick it up here and there to intensify color in some areas, like the side of her tail where I want it to be a little darker so it looks like it has roundness. I'm going to continue to work my way coloring her top and her skin. Now I'm going to move on to her hair. Now her hair has these beautiful little leaves in it, or seaweed in it, and I am just taking my time here and coloring around them, trying not to get them with too much red. I do get a little bit of red here and there, and I am able to cover it up with my green later, but I am trying to avoid. Now that I put down that lighter red, I'm going to grab a darker red and just create a gradation here so it's a little bit darker near her face and gets lighter out towards the tips. And then I'll grab that lighter red that I used earlier and just intensify that red a little bit more. It was getting a little pink instead of red. Now that I'm done with that, I'm going to color a little shell in her hair and her cheeks, and then I'll finish just with my skin color to add a little shadow. Now I'm going to move on to the seaweed. I'm going to grab the same green that I used for her tail and just quickly color in all those little leaves on the seaweed in her hair. Now that I finished the mermaid, I'm going to move on to these coral pieces. I'm going to color them the same lighter red that I used for the mermaid. Again, just colored a little bit of that marker directly at the base of the coral and then stretched out that red ink over the rest of the coral with a damp brush. I'm now going to color this plant with a pink. I'm going to create basically a very colorful under the water scene. Here I'm coloring this little plant kind of purple, like the same purple I used for her top. And now I'm going to use the purple and the pink here in combination on this jellyfish, kind of using the pink for the bottom portion, and then I'm going to use that purple for the top, creating a nice little gradation of color on that jellyfish. Now I'm going to use the same color here that I used for her tail and just color some more of these plants, and then I will move on to the seaweed here. I'm going to use that same green that I used for her tail just at the tips in the center, and then I'm going to use kind of a lighter green, a lime kind of green for the rest of the seaweed, just going to give it a different tone. Now I'm going to start working on some of my fish. Now this one's probably my most complicated fish. I'm going to just color in some black stripes. The color of the back of it, kind of a orange yellow, and then add a little bit of blue for a shadow. Now for this fish I'm going to color it yellow first, as well as the other fish I'm going to color his head yellow. Then I'm going to grab that same green, that lime green that I used earlier for the seaweed, color in the back half of that fish, and then I'm going to grab my darker yellow, add some lines and a little shadow. Now moving on to a starfish, going to color that orange, real simple. Then I'm going to color in this stingray with a really kind of almost like blueprint sketch blue, and then finish with this little fish here using the same orange I used for the starfish, and that will actually complete my coloring. Now that my images are colored, I went ahead and die cut them out with the matching dies. Now this is the Under the Sea panel die. It is an A2 panel die, but we are going to tweak it here to work with our Slimline. I have two panels that are 3 1/4 by 5 1/2. They don't have to be 5 1/2, just 3 1/4. This is going to fit inside our frame on our Slimline card. I then centered the die and then die cut to create this sand and seaweed layer for our under the water scene. Now that I have that layer created, I'm going to create a second layer. So I'm going to grab my second panel and I'm going to grab this kind of rock or coral mountain piece, and I'm just going to center it on this panel and then run that through my die cutting machine, and now I'll have a second layer for my under the water scene. Now I have a piece of contact paper here. I'm going to use this to create a mask. I'm going to create a really simple mask, again using the Under the Sea panel die. This will create a little slope that I'm going to use to ink blend some water layers in my water scene. I definitely could have cut that instead of die cutting it if I preferred. So now I'm going to move on to my Slimline card base. The Slimline card base is 7 1/4 by 8 5/8 and then scored at 3 5/8. That's how you create a Slimline card. And now I'm going to ink blend with some Distress Oxides to kind of create our water. I'm going to do a gradation, so I started with Peacock Feathers, then moved on to Salty Ocean, and now I'm going to finish up with Blueprint Sketch. This is actually just going to be our first layer for our ink blend, so it's kind of splotchy and definitely light. We're going to go a little bit darker now that we have our mask. So I just peeled the backing off of my contact paper mask and position it here onto my card base, and then I'm going to start with the same color that I started with before, Peacock Feathers, and just ink blend right along the edge of that mask, and that creates these kind of lines in our water. And I think this just adds some more detail and makes the background a little bit more interesting, because this water is kind of the main, what you see a lot on this card, so I do want to kind of have it a little bit more interesting than just a gradation. So I'm just going to continue to work my way down, again using whatever color I used in that area before. I'm going to use that for the mask. Now that I've ink blended it, I'm going to spray some water onto my mat, pick it up with my brush, and then just tap on my finger on the brush to release some water spots onto this panel. And this is just going to react with that Distress Oxide and make kind of nice little water spots. Again, another nice detail for the background. Now I'm going to grab my contact paper mask here, and I'm just going to tweak it here to mask off the seaweed so I can ink blend the sand layer. You could definitely use a Post-it note if you don't have a piece of contact paper. Just going to tuck it underneath that edge, and then I'm going to start to ink blend. I'm going to use Antique Linen Distress Oxide as well as tea dye. Start with the Antique Linen, just kind of create my base, and then add a little gradation with the tea dye. Now that I've finished ink blending that, I'm going to add some little spots, some paint spots or ink spots. This is really going to create that speckly look of sand. So I smushed down some Vintage Photo Distress ink, added a little bit of water to it with my brush, and then picked up that ink and just kind of tapping again with my finger to release some of that ink onto the sand, and that will really create that splotchy look of sand. Now that's finished, I'm going to remove the masks and then reposition those contact paper masks to kind of mask off the sand. So now I can ink blend the seaweed. Started with Twisted Citron Distress Oxide, then moved on to Pine Needles just to again create a nice little gradation. Now that I finished ink blending, I'm going to remove the masks, and that layer is done. So now we're ready for our mountain or our coral layer. So I've got several Distress Oxides here. I'm going to start with Squeeze Lemonade and just ink blend kind of randomly on this coral layer. Then I'll move on to Spiced Marmalade, then Twisted Citron, then on to Picked Raspberry. Then I'll finish with a purple. I'm going to use a shaded lilac. These are all similar colors to what I used for coloring all my images. Now that I finished shaded lilac, I'm going to do a little bit of pine needles, and then I'm going to smush out some of my Distress Oxides down onto my water media mat, spray a little bit of water down, and then pick up some of that ink with a damp brush. And again, I'm just going to splatter that ink down onto that coral just to kind of make it a little bit more interesting, add a little bit more depth so it's not just this splotchy ink blended layer. This kind of really starts to add some texture and make it, I think, a little bit more resembling of coral. So I'm just going to continue to splatter that around, and once I got that done, I'm ready for creating my frame. I'm going to start with a panel of black cardstock that is 3 5/8 by 8 5/8. That is the measurements of the front of a Slimline card base. And then I just grabbed the largest die from the Nesting Slim Layers die set and just die cut that panel to create a frame. Now I like to add some dimension to this frame, so I went ahead and cut some black craft foam down to these really long, thin strips. These are only a little bit less than 1/4 inch wide, and I'm going to adhere them on to my frame. Now I really like this black craft foam because it kind of blends in with the black cardstock, so it really kind of creates a clean look. But if I could have changed it, the one thing I would have preferred to have done to create this dimension is actually started with a large panel of black craft foam, a panel that's the size of a Slimline card front, so 3 5/8 by 8 5/8, and then die cut that panel of craft foam with the largest die from the Slim the Nesting Slim Layers die set just the same way I created the cardstock frame. I would have done the same method to create the craft foam frame. But this worked just as well, and it was a great way to kind of use up some of my craft foam scraps. I'm now going to move on to stamping my sentiment. I have my card base here inside my MISTI, as well as some images just to kind of help me figure out where I want that sentiment to go. Once I figured it out, I then picked it up with my MISTI, and now I'm going to ink it up with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and stamp it onto my card front. This sentiment is from the new Under the Sea sentiment stamp set. With my sentiment now stamped, I'm ready to kind of pull all these pieces together and finish up this card. I'm going to start by adhering my dimensional frame directly onto my card front. Once I have that frame in place, I'm now going to move on to some of my scenery layers that I created with the Under the Sea panel. First, just going to adhere that coral layer directly to the card base, and then I've added some foam squares to the back side of this seaweed and sand layer, and I'm just going to pop that inside the frame. I've also added some foam squares to the back side of my mermaid, and I'm going to stick her down. Then I'm going to move on to the rest of my images. I'm going to glue some of my images down, and I'm also going to pop some of them up with foam squares. Just going to do it here and there, again, just adding some dimension, some more interest. I think that makes things a little bit more interesting than all my images kind of just flush with the card base. So I just finished the lower right side, got a lot of the plants stuck down. For some of these plants where they're overlapping an area that already has dimension, I'll just use a tiny amount of craft foam or a foam square just to kind of support a little bit of the side that's hanging off of that dimensional layer underneath. That just gives it a little bit of support. Now I'm going to finish up this card with the rest of my sea life, sticking down that stingray with craft foam, the jellyfish goes flush, and then these last two fish, one is with craft foam and one is flush for the card, and that'll actually finish this card. I'll now hold this card up to the camera so hopefully we get a good look at all the details on this card, and there are a lot of them, from all of our watercolored images that we created from the Mermaid Mail Stamp Set to that ink blended background with the subtle lines that we created with the mask, and even those layers of the coral and sand and seaweed that we used the Under the Sea panel die for. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If you'd like any more information on the products I used, please check out the links below in the description. And if you liked this video, I'd so appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.